Hello, I'm Howard Lau. I'm 17, turning 18 this year. I'm a recreational pilot, and this is FSX Road to RPL. In this series, I aim to assist flight simmers better understand flying and use flight sim as a training tool. Welcome to episode 4, Introduction to Circuits. The objectives of this lesson is to be able to operate the aircraft within the airfield circuit with a safe manner, and to better understand the basic right-of-way and ICAO rules of the air, to be able to take off and land an airplane proficiently using the normal landing configuration, and lastly, to be able to abort the landing at any given moment during the final approach. So what is a circuit? You might have never heard of a circuit, but you have probably heard of a traffic pattern. Well, a circuit is just that. A circuit is defined as a standard rectangular pattern that aircraft flying into an airfield will execute in order to ensure operation in a safe and orderly fashion. And below there's the diagram of a normal circuit. The circuit consists of 5 legs: upwind, crosswind, downwind, base, and final. What is the purpose of circuit training? Well, in circuit training, you'll always be doing touch and goes, so you'll inevitably build a lot of confidence in taking off and landing, both of the hardest maneuvers in flight training. And you'll build proficiency under high workload situations, taking off, landing, energy management, managing other aircraft in the circuit, low altitude. You get the point. And it'll better familiarize yourself with the characteristics of your airplane as you are flying closer to the ragged edge, as they say. Here is a normal circuit of a Cessna 172. We will discuss it in further detail soon. Upwind, that is the first leg of the circuit. That's basically a climb out on the extended center line. There's really nothing that special. Power to full, attitude set to VY attitude, speed 74 knots, trim as required. However, you should maintain runway center line with a very strict fashion and apply wind correction if there is any wind. And when you are turning crosswind, remember to look out first. I was taught at 400 feet, begin your lookout, and at 500 feet, you should be about done, so you start turning. And remember, the turn is a climbing turn, so no more than 20 degrees of bank, please. And please, do not extend crosswind too much. I know people who level off at the circuit height, 1,000 feet, at crosswind, but most of the time they are way too far out. On downwind, you should be level at 1,000 feet above ground level. And I wrote above mean sea level because the airport that I usually fly out of here in Hong Kong and over there in Australia, Moorabbin Airport, is at sea level. But bear in mind, standard circuit altitude is 1,000 feet above ground level. And once you level off, it is normal stuff that we learned last lesson. Attitude, between normal and slow cruise. Speed, let it build to 95 knots. Power, set to 2,000 RPM. Trim, as required. And on downwind, this is really the key position. Or should I say, the position that would either make or break your landing. You need to look at the runway in relation to the wing strut, and that is one of the luxuries of a high-wing aircraft. It should be around 2/3 of the way up. If you are flying a low-wing aircraft, the runway should be around 2/3 of the way down the wing. And during downwind, you're going to do your downwind or your pre-landing checks. And the acronym is BUMFLOW. It's actually not that long. It's simple. You need to test the brakes, make sure the parking brake is off, and make sure the brakes are operational. Undercarriage, that's for standardization only, down and welded. Mixture, rich. Master switch on, you don't want to inadvertently knock it off. Magnetos on both. Fuel, sufficient for go around. Landing light on, of course. Oil temperatures and pressures in the green. Hatches and harnesses secure. And all these checks have to be done every circuit with absolute discipline. So when exactly do you turn to base? Well, you sort of eyeball it. The runway should be about 45 degrees off your shoulder, which is around your 8 o'clock position. At late downwind, the acronym is PASFT. So power, set to 1500 RPM. Maintain the attitude using back pressure. That will help you slow down. Your speed should already be below 110 knots, which is the flap limiting speed for the first stage of flaps. And if it's lower than 110 knots, which will be the case, lower the flaps to 10 degrees. And you'll be surprised. Do not trim yet. You'll know why. Also, during your downwind, do not extend your downwind if it's not required. Because if you lose your engine, you want to be able to make it back. Trust me. When you're at base, after you level off and your speed is within white arc, and white arc is basically the flap limiting speed for 20 degrees and more flaps. And when the speed is within the white arc, flaps should be lowered to 20 degrees. Your attitude should be lowered ever so slightly to achieve the approach attitude. Speed should be around 70 knots. Trim, now you trim, as required. Now do you know why you don't trim that early? Yes? I'll tell you. Well, that's because the attitude wasn't set properly when the flaps were still at 10 degrees. Base is a key position as well. You're going to work with the 3 A's: Aimpoint, Aspect, Airspeed. And you're going to work with these 3 A's all the way down to your landing. Aimpoint. Is it moving up your windscreen? That means you're undershooting. Or is it moving down your windscreen? That means you're overshooting. Aspect. Is the runway geometry flat and fat? Or is it long and skinny? Airspeed. Are you slow? Or are you fast? The base, once again, is a make and break point for your landing. And during your turn to final, please be really careful. Ease it onto final, because this is a dark spot for pilots to kill themselves. Every year, so many pilots kill themselves by pushing too much bottom rudder, end up skidding into the turn, and then spinning. Remember to level off at or above 500 feet AGL. And don't be afraid to turn a bit early. I'd rather you turn early than turn late. And if you ever find yourself overshooting, go around. Once you're established on final, flaps will be set to the final stage, 30 degrees. Attitude, once again, you check it down slightly because you want to maintain the speed still of 70 knots. And you'll trim as required, usually a little bit of nose down, just a little bit. Flaps 10 and 20 would really give you a nose up moment. However, flaps 30 won't. So you trim it as required. And when you're at short final, you reduce the power just a tad, hold the attitude, and basically that should slow you down for free. Speed should come right down to 65 knots. And that's where you want it to be. You don't want it to be all the way at 70 knots. The Cessnas love to float, trust me. And oh god, here we go, the dreaded landing. Yes, here's the first stage of the landing. Approach. Once again, you work with the same 3 A's: Aimpoint, Aspect, Airspeed. The idea is to keep your aimpoint and aspect constant. And you will ride your airspeed down using power and holding the attitude. The aimpoint is the point on the runway that stays still, and that's not the touchdown point. You pick an aimpoint, and then you keep that point on the same point in your windscreen. That way, when you flare, you're going to be right over the aimpoint. Aspect, the geometry of the runway, that will tell whether or not you're high or low. Does the runway seem very short, very flat, very fat? Or does the runway seem very long, very narrow? If you're high, it should be long and narrow. If you're low, it's fat and flat. Your airspeed, is it fast or is it slow? Ask yourself these questions. Keep yourself in the information loop. And here's a photo that I've taken earlier on in my flight training in Australia, coming into Turin Airfield, runway 22. The aim point is the red dot that I've put there, which is the piano keys or the threshold. The aim point at that time stays around the same place in in the windscreen, which is good. Aspect, a little bit low, but acceptable. Airspeed, which is for the Sling 2 that I was flying, 70 knots. Basically, other than the aspect, which is a little bit off, this is a good approach. And these three are comparisons. The top is when you're too high. As you can see, the runway is narrow and long. A proper descent angle is a good balance between the too high and too low. Not too narrow, not too long, just right. But when you're too low, look at that. The runway seems flat, seems very flat, and it seems very short. However, you might ask, what controls what? Does power control speed, or does attitude control speed? Does power control glide path, or does attitude control glide path? So many questions, and equally so many answers. You know, I hear old wives' tales a lot. Some people say pitch for glide path, power for airspeed. Some people say power for altitude, pitch for airspeed. And as of now, I hear pitch for airspeed, power for altitude the most, which is the second. However, I disagree with both of them because that's not what I was taught, and that was not something that worked for me. So what controls what? The answer is simple. To control the aim point, you use attitude and power. To control the aspect, you use attitude and power. To control the airspeed, you use attitude and power. It's all the same because consider the following equation. Pitch plus power equals performance. They are not mutually exclusive. They have to be controlled hand in hand. A pitch change will require a power change. Likewise, a power change will require a pitch change. So therefore, if you pitch up, you need a power up. If you pitch down, you need a power down. However, I'm only talking about very small corrections, not massive corrections that you might see in Hollywood. And here we go, the second stage of the landing, the roundout. Dun dun dun! It's honestly not that scary. The roundout is defined as the pitch change that results in the reduction of the rate of descent into ground effect. When the nose is approaching the aiming point, the power slowly reduces to idle. Your eyes transitions to the end of the runway, far end of the runway. That is so you can use your peripheral vision to judge whether or not you are sinking, or you are staying, or you are staying level, or you might be even ballooning. That means climbing a little bit. And your attitude should be set just enough to stop the descent. Just enough, because you want to stop the descent, and the most important thing is don't pull it back more. You want to stop the descent, wait for the sink, and then pull it back more. And here's the timing bit of it. That's what gets everyone. I remember slamming it down because I rounded out way too early and I stalled it in. I remember slamming the nose wheel down first, even because I thought I was too high and I didn't want to round out too high. Well, here's a foolproof method of doing it. It's called the runway expansion effect. Now, as you approach the runway at a constant aspect, you will see that the runway expands in your windscreen. However, the expansion is not linear. As you can see, from the 10 seconds to 8 second mark, the expansion is the highest. And coincidentally, from the 10 seconds to 8 seconds mark, that's when you're around 10 feet above the runway. Just when you should start reducing the power and bringing the nose up. Very convenient, isn't it? Well, it is, thanks to physics and optics and human factors. However, that method may not work for everyone. It works for a lot of people, it doesn't work for everyone. Another method of timing that I found very useful is that, consider this. The aiming point only stays at the same place when you're far enough away from it. However, when you approach it, as in get very close to it, it will come down the windshield. That means if you are close and you see the aiming point coming down your windshield, tucking under your nose, it's nearly time, or it's time to round out. And usually I round out when the aim point just disappears under the nose. Start rounding out. But if you are far and you see the aim point moving down, while you're overshooting, reduce power, pitch down slightly. And oh god, here's the second last section of the dreaded landing, the flare. The flare is basically the establishment of landing attitude as a result of increased nose up attitude due to reduction in airspeed after roundout. Now you remember during roundout, we have reduced power to flight idle. So the propeller is basically producing no thrust or power. So how would you maintain altitude? Well, you're just going to increase the pitch more and more and more and more. So what are you going to do? Well, it's very simple. I like to put landing like this. When you land, you want to hit the runway, but you want to miss for as long as possible. In order to establish landing attitude, you just got to keep flying the plane. You just got to hold the plane off just a couple feet above the runway, and then when the aircraft is ready to touch down, it will touch down smoothly and gently, and hopefully uneventfully. During the flare, a lot of students end up ballooning. That's because students, and even myself, I still have that fear. That we still have the fear of the ground. And I think the biggest tip here is to really, really look down to the far end of the runway. Because you only start applying more back pressure when you see a sink. When you see the two sides of the runway move up in your peripheral vision. Then you apply a little bit more back pressure to sort of hold it there. As your instructor would probably always say, hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it. And sometimes I say it to myself as well. So after landing, will you do a touch and go or a full stop? Well, I hope you have made that decision much earlier than this. But if it's a touch and go, you have 3 steps you need to do. You got to select flaps up. You got to retrim only if there's sufficient runway. Retrimming can take a bit of a while. And then after that, you apply full power. You rotate at 55 knots and you climb out again, just as usual. Or if you're coming in for a full stop, let's say. When you're coming in for a full stop, after touchdown, don't apply forward pressure. Never. You want to hold the yoke back as far as possible. Hold the nose off the runway. And then as the nose touches down, hold the yoke back. Just keep holding the yoke back. And then gently and progressively apply the brakes. The reason why you hold the yoke back is so you put the weight on the main landing gears, so when you apply the brakes, it's going to be more effective and it's going to reduce the risk of skidding. And when you vacate the runway, only when you vacate the runway, or if you're backtracking the runway, you go flaps up, lights off except for beacon and taxi. Your transponder goes to standby, and of course, I'm a big fan of it, you lean the mixture 1 to 2 inches. So here are some key tips to a good or a great landing. A stable approach. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, in the airlines, they define it very well. No drastic corrections and no rates of descent of more than 1,000 feet per minute. I think we can adapt a similar thing. I think we can simplify it, however, but we could adapt a similar thing. How I define a stable approach is no drastic corrections. We are down the center line, and most importantly, we have a stable airspeed, and we have, of course, a rate of descent of not more than 1,000 feet a minute. And if any one of those are violated, I push the power forward and I go around. And the keys to a good landing, and the second key to a good landing is you have to have a fixed, selected aiming point that is within the first third of the runway. First third, remember that. And an aiming point, and I mean an aiming point by, once again, that point that stays still in your windscreen. You keep it there. You keep it there, and that's where you flare. That's not where you touch down, but that's where you flare. And remember one thing. If you ever hear on the internet, pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. Wipe that out of your brain, because I was so confused when somebody taught me that in Hong Kong in the club. I'm not going to name names, but when I tried doing that, I messed up my landings every single time. Is pitch, power, coupling. We shouldn't say pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. We should say pitch and power equals performance. They are not mutually exclusive. If you pitch up, you need a power up. If you pitch down, you need a power down. If you want to slow down, you need a power down and hold the pitch up. Just like that. You can't get away with only altering one variable. And of course, the most important thing, smooth and small corrections. Please, 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 no jerking of the yoke as well. Not even during the flare, ever. I see very experienced pilots, and correct me if I'm wrong. I know nothing. I'm just a recreational pilot. And honestly, I'm not saying this sarcastically. I'm willing to learn a lot, because ultimately we are all student pilots at the end of the day. But no jerking of the yoke during flare, ever. Ever, 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 ever. That's just pilot-induced oscillations. That can cause quite expensive repairs. And so yeah, no jerking of the yoke. And I used to jerk the yoke as well. Bad habit, I know. And I think the best way to not jerk the yoke, and I mean jerking the yoke as an elevator jerking, and I think the best way to stop yourself from jerking the yoke is a loose grip of the controls. And that's more for the real world flying, I know, but I'm still going to say it. Now whenever I flare, when I hold the yoke, I usually have my thumb on it as well. But when I flare, I actually open my palm and I move my thumb away. And basically, I'm just patting the yoke back. Just using a half open palm, just patting the yoke back like that. And that really helps my landings. Even in high wind conditions, I still do that. And it really helps, because, and you'll be surprised how little correction you actually need. And you'll be surprised how much overcorrection you've done earlier on when you were jerking the yoke. And I think we are moving on to the most important maneuver of the circuit, which is basically stopping the landing. Go around. Go around. When should you go around? Let's just get our head around this. When should we go around? Well, you should go around when the first thought of going around crosses your mind. At least that's what the FAA says. And that's true, because it has happened to me multiple times. I've had to call off a landing multiple times. So, and also, go around for obvious reasons: unstable approach, a sudden gust, or traffic on the runway, or ATC told you to go around. Nonetheless, there's a particular procedure, like everything in aviation, for go around. The acronym is PAFT. Power goes to full. Attitude, don't go to VY attitude yet. Oh no, that's a recipe for stalling. Attitude, go to a level flight attitude initially, a normal cruise attitude initially. Let the airplane accelerate, and then establish climb attitude. Flaps. When you establish, as soon as you apply power and you establish the attitude, immediately retract to the flaps to 20 degrees. Because anything more than 20 degrees is just drag. And after you retract to 20 degrees, you retrim a little bit. Just a little bit. And then once your airspeed is more than 60 knots, retract it to 10 degrees. And when it's more than 70 knots, retract it to all the way up. And then slowly get yourself back up to climb attitude and then trim. And you can establish climb attitude when you are at 20 degrees. And trim is important, because you will need a lot of nose down trim when you apply power, because during landing, of course, it's a nose heavy aircraft, and you'll have a lot of nose up trim. So when you apply power, you'll need a lot of nose down trim to compensate for that. And also, one more thing. Crosswind considerations. Oh no, crosswind. Yes, I was that guy. I was very scared of crosswind before, until I really practiced, and in Melbourne where I trained, we were constantly exposed to crosswind. So now I feel very fortunate. Back then, I felt resentful, but now I feel very thankful that I trained there. But anyway, the method one, I think, is the best method. I think only. You choose what you want. Method one is called crab and kick. So you might have probably seen it in the airliner. So basically, you point the nose towards the wind using the weathercocking effect, which is the effect where the aircraft tends to point into the wind, no matter what. So basically, what you do is you point your nose towards the wind, apply a little bit more power, high approach speed, and then when you're about to round out, you are going to push the rudder to align your nose with the center line and adjust your ailerons to control drift. Drift as in your lateral movement. Whether or not if you're moving left, you apply right, you apply aileron in opposite direction, etc., etc. And it's worth noting that normally when we apply rudder, let's say we want to align ourselves with the center line, and let's say we apply right rudder, you need left aileron because now you'll be vectoring lift against the wind. And this is basically the crab. And usually I start the kick after I reduce power. So when I reduce power for the round out, I start kicking the nose out and then going into a slip and then landing. And the second method is basically a slip, basically the last stage of the first method, but the only difference is that you fly the slip all the way down. So you use, again, the rudder for centerline and the aileron for drift for the entire approach. Once again, you need a higher approach speed because you have just accelerated your own stall speed. And you're basically flying the entire approach like the final parts of the crab and kick method. The reason why I'm not a fan of slip is that you have to constantly have muscle tension, which is a bit painful for me. And but mostly is that I have just accelerated my stall speed. And if I stall, I'm out of coordination. Well, I get a wing drop and I probably die. So I am not a fan of slip. But if you use it, once again, use it carefully. But like anything in aviation, use it carefully. But just watch your speed, get a bit of higher approach speed, maybe even less flaps. And slip, surprisingly, most people prefer slip, but I prefer a crab. There is no right or wrong method, and I am not the person to say whether or not one is right and one is wrong, because there's no right and wrong. It all depends on you. Try both and choose one. That's what I did. So I chose the crab and kick. You might choose the slip. So there you go. 2 tricks in your bag. And this is basically what a slip is. You're basically flying wing down. And it's also worth noting that in a crosswind landing, you want to land upwind wheel first. The most satisfying feeling is getting the 3 chirps. So it's upwind wheel, upwind main gear, downwind main gear, and then nose gear down. That's the most satisfying feeling in a crosswind landing. Just those 3 chirps, they are amazing. And finally, we are going to talk about the right of way in the circuit. And I think it's worth talking about because when you are up to this stage in your training, you're close to your first solo. So you need to know the right of way when you're alone in the cockpit because you have no instructor telling you what to do. So right of way, it's pretty simple. The more maneuverable aircraft gives way to the less maneuverable aircraft. Common sense. The aircraft in the circuit will have right of way over an aircraft joining either the base leg or the final leg. Landing aircraft will always have right of way over departing aircraft. This is really apparent when you're holding short of the runway. So if you're holding short and you hear somebody, let's say on base or on final, just hold short. Just wait for them to land, vacate the runway, and then go. And remember, unpowered aircraft will always have the right of way. So if you hear a glider on frequency needing to land on your field, let them do it first. And that's it for today. I'll see you in the cockpit. And as per usual, have fun, fly safe.